Microphone button on. Okay, welcome to the CERIAS Computer Security Seminar from Purdue University. Our speaker today is Howard Schmidt. Howard has had a long and distinguished career. He has been the Chief Security Officer for Microsoft and eBay. In between those assignments was the Cybersecurity Advisor for the White House. He holds positions as a Professor of Research at Idaho State, Professor of Practice at Georgia Tech, and still as a Special Agent in the Criminal Investigation Division for the U.S. Army Reserve. So we're glad to have him here with us, and his schedule is such that I almost feel like I need to remind him that he's here today in Indiana.
Right. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for coming in this morning, and I apologize for the constantly shifting schedule here, but between air flights and I'm leaving for an identity management conference in Australia Friday morning, so I have to bug out this afternoon and get back to the West Coast. I'd like to sort of conduct this as interactive as possible. Obviously, I think we all can use a nap when we have a talking head up there at the podium, but today I'd like to have it as interactive as possible. So feel free to interrupt, ask questions, challenge some of the things I say, ask me to amplify, or maybe move on to some other areas. Please feel free to take the liberty to do that. Sort of the broad topic, and it's really interesting when we talk about the whole information security, is the changes I think that we've seen over the past 20 years when it comes to how do we define information security and what it means in our day-to-day life. I think one of the first things that I want to start out by citing is back in 1996, President Clinton was in office at the time, and there was some discussion at the White House. At the time I was over at Air Force Office of Special Investigations as the Director of Computer Crime and Information Warfare. And we had seen as the military, U.S. military, had shifted from the MILNET and a closed network environment to the Internet for very good, valid reasons. One, first and foremost, a lot better technology in the public sector, private sector than we had in the public sector. Secondly, the cost was absolutely phenomenal as far as the savings we got in the military, and that could be debated later on through the years as we move to commercial off-the-shelf software. But the biggest thing was just the ability to communicate through what is then, with the early days of the Internet, by many, many stretches of the imagination. It was just a more efficient mechanism to communicate. But with that came the baggage of the people who had been playing in the early days of the Internet since the mid-'80s, early '90s, had migrated with it, and those who were doing bad stuff just sort of followed along. And what better target was than to find out where the UFOs are really, really hidden at. Where Area 51, where the alien was, what the alien really looked like, and where the photographs were hidden. And seriously, that was some of the things that people started to look for. They try to hack in many cases successfully, into military systems, looking for that sort of information. So as a consequence, as this information started to sift through the U.S. government, it hit the White House, and of course the White House said, well, wait a minute now. Why is the military doing this, and why are we going to these commercial systems instead of having literally thousands and thousands and thousands of government programmers warehoused in really ugly buildings with no pinball machines or anything else like we see in development communities today? Why are they doing that, and what are the real risks to this? And if the military is doing it, what about private sector? Its perception was, which was accurate, is the private sector is doing more with information technology than the government was. So consequently, if everybody's doing all this, who's watching it? Who's in charge of security of it? Who's the one that's protecting is what has been redefined now as critical infrastructure? And the answer was nobody really knew. We knew what we saw going on in the defense side of the house. We knew some of the great technology being rolled out from the open source community to a limited extent in those days, the Apple/Macintosh community, and of course the 800-pound gorilla in the room was the Microsoft environment. We saw that pumping out there, but really didn't understand how it was more than just a desktop server issue in some businesses and how it was sort of penetrating every facet of our society. So in 1996, President Clinton then put together a commission called the President's Commission for Critical Infrastructure Protection, with basically, asking a few things. One, first and foremost, what is this? What does information technology have to do with our day-to-day society life? Secondly, who's in charge of security? Third, what happens if something goes wrong? Where do we wind up having a catastrophic failure if indeed something goes wrong? And who's in charge of fixing it? And so that commission lasted for about a year. The interesting piece about this commission, which was not dissimilar to other presidential commissions in the past, but this particular one was really interesting because they had people from the Department of Defense, which was clearly an issue. They had people from the FBI and the Secret Service and other government bureaucracies, but they brought in people from PG&E from California. They brought people from water treatment facilities. They brought a lot of people into that environment that you normally wouldn't expect to see in this sort of a presidential commission. And although it was somewhat challenged at the time it was put out, it was probably the smartest thing they could have done. Because after a year, what happened, they had a really good perspective now on what this all means, what the interdependencies are, and who really owns it. So it was interesting, after the first year, the report came out, which is still out there publicly available. It said a few things. One, first and foremost, that what we defined at the time as critical infrastructure, which was transportation systems, gas and oil, telecommunications and internet service providers, healthcare services, energy, gas, oil, these sort of things, all these sort of things which we depend on for the basics day-to-day necessities of life, were primarily owned by the private sector. It was determined as a result of that study that about 85% of what we know as CIP at that time, or we knew as CIP at that time, was owned and operated by the private industry. Less than 15% of it was government owned, which was really interesting. The second piece of it, that there was really no cohesiveness. We didn't know what happened if you had a failure in one spot, what the effect would be in other areas. Classic example, which we learned years later. How many here remember the power blackout in the Northeast here a few years ago? Remember that one? The after-fact analysis was that a power generating station, I think it was in Ohio or somewhere, was overloaded, which called this cascading effect, which called the power to go out. Okay, that we knew about. Those sort of things we've known for years were possible to happen. We saw years ago where a tree fell in a windstorm in the Pacific Northwest and the lights went out in Arizona, 1,500 miles away. It's because the way the power grid works and the distribution mechanisms work, that we basically sell excess power to different places when it's not needed in one place, and we just sort of move that stuff around. What people didn't think about the long-term effect of that. So you can imagine when that power went out in the Northeast, then you start to have issues where police agencies and fire agencies that were dependent on backup generators after 24 hours couldn't get their systems up and running. They, in turn, couldn't get fuel because the fuel depots were run by computer systems, so they weren't able to refill the fuel trucks. So the cascading effects, the interdependencies, became very, very, very clear then. That was one of the things we identified with the initial commission report, that we have tremendous interdependencies that nobody really has modeled much to understand what are the interdependencies and who needs to fix what to get these things back up and running. Individual verticals, individual stovepipes, we had a pretty good idea. Power goes out, here's what the cascading effects are, but not the interdependencies. So that was the second thing of the report. The third thing of the report, there was no government agency sort of in charge of all this. And notwithstanding any of our personal feelings about whether the government's efficient, effective, or even smart in some cases, the bottom line is government does have a role, particularly when it comes to national security and public safety. So as a consequence, we wound up in a situation where saying, okay, well, if something bad happens, does the Department of Defense step in? Well, generally from a legal perspective, the answer to that is no. There's a law called posse comitatus, which basically specifically prohibits the military from taking civilian actions because of what's happened back in Revolutionary War days. So do we depend on the telecommunication companies? Well, there was an issue that was brought up. Well, they're very competitive. So why would one telecommunication